Hey y'all, it's entry number 69 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on Amon-Ra St. wide receiver, Detroit Lions. We'll start with the positives with Amon-Ra St. Brown's fantasy profile. The Sun God. Between weeks 13 and 18, Amon-Ra St. Brown showed the world why his nickname is the Sun God. In these 6 games, St. Brown had 51 receptions on 67 targets for 560 receiving yards and 5 receiving touchdowns. From a fantasy standpoint, during this time, he was the WR2 in standard with 100.1 total fantasy points and 16.7 fantasy points per game. The WR2 in half PPR formats with 125.6 total fantasy points and 20.9 fantasy points per game. And the WR2 in full PPR formats with 151.1 total fantasy points and 25.2 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. Whenever a young player has a stretch like this, you have to pay attention because it could mean that they are potentially the next big thing. The next thing I really like about Amon-Ra St. Brown's fantasy profile is his chemistry with Jared Goff. While Jared Goff is not the most prolific passing quarterback in the league, he does have great chemistry with Amon-Ra St. Brown. It was reported prior to the 2021 season that Jared Goff had reportedly been teaching Amon-Ra St. Brown some things that Cooper Kupp did in Los Angeles. It showed on the field, as last year Amon-Ra St. Brown had 90 receptions, tied for the 15th most in the NFL, on 119 targets for 912 receiving yards and 5 receiving touchdowns. This chemistry helps St. Brown's fantasy value. The last thing I really like about Amon-Ra St. Brown's fantasy profile is his potential to improve. Amon-Ra St. Brown played very well last year, but perhaps the most encouraging thing about it was that he did it as a rookie. He's going to turn just 23 years old in October, so there's still plenty of time for him to grow and improve. Moving on to some of the concerns with Amon-Ra St. Brown's fantasy profile. Added competition. The Detroit Lions added some competition for targets this offseason by acquiring DJ Chark through free agency and drafting Jameson Williams in the first round of the 2022 NFL Draft. In addition, during the stretch that Amon-Ra St. Brown really balled out between weeks 13 and 18, his teammates TJ Hawkinson and DeAndre Swift were banged up and either missed games or played injured. This competition for targets could make it more difficult for Amon-Ra to be successful in 2022. The next concern I have with Amon-Ra St. Brown's fantasy profile is the likely subpar offense. The Detroit Lions made some improvements, but it's important to remember that they were just 22nd in yards per game with 322.6 and 25th in points per game with 19.1 according to ESPN last year. The last major concern I have with Amon-Ra St. Brown's fantasy profile is his red zone usage. Amon-Ra St. Brown saw just 14 targets inside the 20, tied for the 35th most in the NFL, and 5 targets inside the 10, tied for the 55th most in 2021 according to Pro Football Reference. This red zone usage is fairly mediocre, and it seems more likely that the Lions looked at some of their other wide receivers around the red zone. Some additional thoughts on Amon-Ra St. Brown's fantasy profile. In 2021, Amon-Ra St. Brown finished as the WR23 in standard, with 137.3 total fantasy points and 8.6 fantasy points per game. The WR21 in half PPR formats, with 182.3 total fantasy points and 11.4 fantasy points per game, and the WR21 in full PPR formats, with 227.3 total fantasy points and 14.2 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. In half PPR formats, during the 2021 season, Amon-Ra St. Brown had 6 out of 17 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 3 out of 17 games with 5 to 9.9 fantasy points, 3 out of 17 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 2 out of 17 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, and 3 out of 17 games with over 20 fantasy points according to fantasy data. New offensive coordinator. The Detroit Lions officially fired Anthony Lynn this offseason and promoted Ben Johnson to offensive coordinator. Johnson and head coach Dan Campbell allegedly shared play calling duties toward the end of last year, which coincidentally was when Amon-Ra St. Brown had his best games. NFL Hard Knocks is covering the Detroit Lions this preseason, which could lead to a slight price increase for all the Lions players. Personal opinion: Amon-Ra St. Brown is going off the board as WR23 about pick 63 overall on ESPN and WR27 about pick 76 overall on Yahoo. I was pretty low on him going into this write-up, and I like him a little more as a fantasy player after doing more research. But this still seems a bit high for him for my personal taste, as there are some other talented wide receivers currently going after him that I simply prefer more, and because I'm also a little worried that strong late season stretch had quite a bit to do with the lack of other quality receiving options. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization. Amon-Ra St. Brown has been a community ambassador for UHSM, United Health Share Ministries, a faith-based healthcare nonprofit founded on Christian beliefs and values. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.